All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for either coming back from last week to this second session, or if you missed last week, welcome to this year's adult education class between Pesach and Shavuot. I have a lot to cover. I think I have a lot to cover today, and I want to end on time. So we're going to get started. I'm going to have a brief question period in sort of early in the session, and then we're going to launch into the primary material that we're going to cover today. So as you know, the focus this year is on Baruch Spinoza, and I noted last week I'm referring to him as Baruch Spinoza by his Hebrew name because we are focusing on his Jewish roots and legacy. So we're putting him in a Jewish context within Jewish intellectual history, as opposed to focusing on various aspects of his very significant impact on the Western philosophical tradition, in which he is known as Benedict or Benedictus, which is just the Latin for Baruch or blessed, and his Portuguese nickname was Bento. But I'm going to refer to him as Baruch Spinoza. So we're focusing on this rebellious son who notoriously rejected the fundamentals of classical Judaism, and again, went on to become one of the most important philosophers in the non-Jewish Western world. But we're addressing the Jewish dimensions of his thought. So despite his rebelliousness and despite his defiance, I'm going to argue that he really came out of a Jewish tradition, a tradition of Jewish thought, at least in part. It doesn't explain all of his thinking, but I think it does explain elements of his thinking. So there were roots of his thinking, his radical and heretical thought that had anchors in classical Jewish sources. And he also had an impact on the Jewish world. If you could mute yourself, please. He also had an impact on the Jewish world, on Jews of various stripes. From secular Jews, he was known to many as the first secular Jew, really the first modern Jew. But I'm going to argue today that he's also had an impact on modern traditional Jews. So Jews in the traditional world who grapple with classical Jewish sources. So I hope to show that he had both Jewish roots and a Jewish legacy outside of his context as a major philosophical figure in the Western tradition. Let me just quickly reiterate the biographical facts about Spinoza so that we're all on the same page. He lived in the 17th century. His years were 1632 to 1677, so he didn't live a particularly long life. He was the son of Marranos, and by that I mean his parents were literally non-Jews. They were Christians who had been forcibly converted. And the sort of background to Spinoza, you really have to go back even a century before the Spanish expulsion, to 1391 or so, when the Inquisition in Spain started. Jews began to be persecuted. A century later, in 1492, as we saw, was the Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish expulsion, Jews were expelled from Spain. They fled to Portugal, but that place of refuge was short-lived. Portugal started its own Inquisition, and 5 years later expelled the Jews from Portugal. So the quite large and prosperous population, Jewish population of the Iberian Peninsula, as of 1497 was gone. There were really no more Jews in the Iberian Peninsula. They had either been expelled or converted forcibly, or they were given the choice to either leave or convert. Some of them chose conversion. Many of them left, but by the time they left the Iberian Peninsula, they perhaps had been already converted. So it turned out that Spinoza's direct ancestors were Jews who had converted and found their way. They migrated eventually to Amsterdam, which in Holland, the Dutch Republic, which at the time was a relatively cosmopolitan and tolerant society. So Jews were treated pretty well, not perfectly. There were still, as I stressed last week, there were still pressures on the Jewish community to have their religious life in orderly fashion, to keep their house in order. The Christian ecclesiastical authorities didn't want Jewish heretics hanging around the community who might influence Christians. And in fact, we know that Spinoza went on to influence Christians and in a way that the Christian authorities did not appreciate. The Christians also reacted quite vehemently to Spinoza. But Spinoza himself grew up an openly practicing Jew. By the time of his generation in Amsterdam, the Jews were practicing openly, and he was given a very solid Jewish education, a very deep education in Tanakh, in Bible. He was a brilliant student. We're sure in the yeshiva that he grew up in. So he was quite expert in Hebrew grammar. He later wrote a book about Hebrew grammar. So he was very, very familiar with Tanakh, with the Bible. He had three excellent, very knowledgeable rabbis as teachers. He probably did not get much of a Talmudic education because he discontinued his formal Jewish education in his late teens as he needed to help his father in the family business. They imported dried nuts and fruits, or nuts and dried fruits. But he got a very good education Jewishly, and he was an openly practicing Jew. He himself was not a Marrano. At some point, he was an original radical thinker. At some point in his late teens, he began to drift away from the tradition. We don't know exactly why or how that happened. And in 1656, when he was only 23 years old, the Amsterdam Jewish community, when we saw last week, issued in very vitriolic terms his cherem, his excommunication ban, and banished him from the community. Spinoza was probably okay with being banished. I think he had gotten fed up with the community by then. Probably his Jewish observance and certainly his Jewish beliefs had drifted away from those of the traditional community. He was banned. He left the community, lived among like-minded Christian thinkers, became known over time as Benedict. He really was alienated from his Jewish identity. I don't think he felt any Jewishness left in his life, but many Jews later give him credit for never having converted. So other Jews in his place might have converted to Christianity. Spinoza did not. He lived, again, a relatively short life, but left a very large imprint on the world. The world was really never the same after Baruch Spinoza. We're going to focus today on one really of his two greatest books, the Theological Political Treatise, which was published anonymously in 1670. His authorship became known fairly soon thereafter because he had become well known in certain circles as an original radical philosopher. And we'll focus on passages from that very important book. But again, the Western world and the Jewish world were really never the same after Spinoza's thought emerged. Let me just give you quickly an overview of the two components of his heretical thought that we're going to focus on. The first we're going to focus on today is his biblical criticism. The second is his radical conception of God. And let me start with the second. So we'll focus on that next week, but let me start with that and just give you I'll adumbrate a sort of a summary of his heretical conception of God, which we will go into detail next week. Essentially, he didn't believe in the God of our forefathers, in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Spinoza's God was essentially interchangeable with nature. God was not the creator, so God didn't create the world. God was not a revealer, so God did not reveal the Torah to the Jews or reveal anything else to anyone, any religious community. God does not intervene in history, so therefore Spinoza did not believe in miracles. God doesn't speak with human beings, so therefore Spinoza didn't believe in prophecy. So in various ways, because God is not creator or revealer, God does not interact with human history. So that conception of God was very radical for his time. And I'll argue next week that it had some Jewish roots in classical Jewish sources, the sort of equation between God and nature. And it certainly had a large impact on Jewish thinking afterwards. But today we're going to focus on his equally radical biblical criticism. And in just very quick outline, we're going to get into this, his conception of the Bible in detail today. But in broad strokes, he believed the Bible was a human fallible document. So it was not divinely, because God doesn't reveal things, it was not divinely revealed. It was humanly constructed, humanly preserved, and therefore bears and reflects the defects of human authorship and human transmission. So the Bible is a book like any other. It should be studied as such. And by Bible, I'm referring to the Jewish Bible. Yes. So the Hebrew Bible. When I talk about the Bible today, it's the Jewish Bible, the Torah or the Tanakh more generally. So Spinoza's Bible is not the classical Jewish Bible, but I will argue that his reading of the Hebrew Bible, the way he interpreted it, had Jewish roots and definitely left a legacy in Jewish intellectual history. That's the overview of the two main strands of his heresy that I'm going to focus on. What I want to do is wrap up some of the passages from last week that we didn't quite finish. So what I did last week was trace the intellectual history of the concept of cherem, of the excommunication that he suffered in 1656, this very vitriolic cherem that has, as we saw last week, had roots in the Torah. The Torah has a conception of cherem that in places is quite violent, and the curses that were leveled against Spinoza had some of that vitriol in them. It was, as I said last week, the most vitriolic cherem ever issued by the Amsterdam Jewish community. And as we'll see in a moment, and as I mentioned last week, it has never been rescinded. So in theory, it is still in effect. Okay, I'm going to hopefully share my screen and share my source sheet with you. Can everyone see the source sheet? I hope you can. If for some reason you can't, if someone please tell me. But I believe you can all see it. And as you see, this is session 2. We'll be addressing biblical criticism. So these are leftover passages from last week, but I think quite interesting. The first one is from David Ben-Gurion, of course, well known as one of the founders of modern Israel. He wrote this in 1953 between his 2 stints as Prime Minister of Israel. Ben-Gurion was a huge admirer of Spinoza. He viewed Spinoza as a sort of proto-Zionist. There's a reference in the Theological Political Treatise to, potentially the future reinstitution of the national community of the Jews in Israel. And Spinoza also denigrated diaspora Judaism. So he was, a lot of Zionists were fond of Spinoza. And David Ben-Gurion was not a fan of the 1656 cherem. He wrote in 1953, the Amsterdam community of that time was not the Hebrew nation. The 17th century was not the eternity of the eternal people. And the Jews of Amsterdam in 1656 did not have the authority or power to excommunicate the immortal Spinoza forever. He goes on to say in this paragraph that Socrates was condemned by the Greek society, but Greeks still ended up studying Socrates. So the same should happen to Spinoza. Spinoza should be rehabilitated, as it says at the end of the paragraph, among the great works of the mind produced by the Jewish people. There is no need to agree with all of Spinoza's ideas and views regarding the critical reading of the Bible. That's what we'll focus on today. About politics, or about the identity of God and nature and human destiny. That's what we'll focus on next week. In order to recognize the genius from Amsterdam as one of the great sons of our people and the most original and profound thinker, and this is quite a statement, who emerged in our nation between the redaction of the Bible and the birth of Einstein. By the way, Einstein was another fan of Spinoza. Everything Spinoza wrote, both what we like and what we do not, belongs to the spiritual treasury of Judaism and belongs on the bookshelf containing the most honored works produced by the Jewish people. The Amsterdam community had sufficient reason to banish Spinoza then. I was asked last week whether the cherem was justified. And I answered yes. I believe in its time, Spinoza was certainly a heretic. And he was unwilling to conform his beliefs and practices to those of the community. That put the community, and importantly, that put the community in peril with respect to the Jewish community's hosts in the Christian outside world. And they couldn't really afford to have a heretic like Spinoza espousing views that could jeopardize the security and standing of the Jewish community. So even Ben-Gurion acknowledges that the Amsterdam community probably had reason to issue the cherem then, but that doesn't mean it should have any import today. Greater and more important reasons require the redemption of Spinoza's heritage from a foreign language. The ban was the product of circumstances that prevailed in a specific and passing time and place. Spinoza the Blessed is an immortal born of the eternal people, and we must bring back into our Hebrew language and culture the writings of the most original thinker and most profound philosopher Judaism has produced in the last 2,000 years. So quite strong terms from Ben-Gurion. So he wasn't necessarily asking that the ban be lifted because he thought it didn't really need to be lifted. He just simply wanted to ignore the ban, ignore the cherem, rehabilitate Spinoza in the community, translate all of his writings into Hebrew, and bring him back within the warm embrace of the Jewish community. So from Ben-Gurion, I wanted to bring us to really the present day. This next text is from just a few months ago. And it is a letter from a rabbi in Amsterdam. So one of the sort of leading rabbis in the present day Amsterdam community, to Professor Yitzchak Melamed, who's an Israeli who is now a professor at Johns Hopkins University here in the United States. Melamed is a Spinoza scholar, wanted to visit the community in Amsterdam. They have an archive in the same synagogue that Spinoza was raised in and was excommunicated from. They have an archive of Spinoza materials. Melamed wanted to visit the synagogue and the archive and produce a film about Spinoza. So he requested permission to do so from Rabbi Sarfati. And Rabbi Sarfati did not embrace the request. The Chachamim, the scholars and Parnasim officers of Kahal Kadosh Talmud Torah, and that was the synagogue that we saw that excommunicated Spinoza, excommunicated Spinoza in his writings with the severest possible ban, a ban that remains in force for all time and cannot be rescinded. You have devoted your life to the study of Spinoza's banned works and the development of his ideas, meaning you, Professor. Your request to visit our complex and create a film about this Epicurus, this heretic, in our synagogue and yeshiva, and that's the name of the yeshiva that Spinoza attended, I believe, when he grew up in Amsterdam almost 400 years ago, is incompatible with our centuries-old halachic, historic, and ethical tradition, and an unacceptable assault on our identity and heritage. I therefore deny your request and declare you persona non grata in the Portuguese synagogue complex. And I find it amusing. He ends the letter. I wish you a meaningful Hanukkah. Professor Melamed's request to visit and do some research about Spinoza and create a film about him was rejected by this Amsterdam rabbi only late last year. in response to that, 2 days later, Rabbi Nathan Cardozo, who is a very interesting rabbi. He's from the famous Cardozo family. He was born in Amsterdam and trained in Haredi yeshivas, so he has a very orthodox upbringing and educational training. But he's an eclectic thinker, and he doesn't want the ban on Spinoza to be embraced anymore. So he wrote a letter to Rabbi Sarfati, who had issued this letter of denial to the professor. And he wrote, "Shalom. Yesterday, I was overwhelmed by the emails I received showing me the letter from 2 days ago that you sent to Professor Yitzhak Malamed in the USA. It would seem that you may be ignorant of the fact that the famous former rabbi of Israel, Rabbi Yitzhak Halevi Herzog, has already stated that the ban was only enforced halachically as long as Spinoza was alive. Furthermore, it would seem you were unaware of the story concerning the ban and the many deliberations concerning the real cause of this ban and the very teachings of Spinoza himself," which seems to suggest that, like I do, Rabbi Cardozo thinks there's still some relevance and some utility in reading Spinoza for Jewish purposes, that he had roots in the Jewish tradition and left a significant impact on Jewish intellectual history. He goes on to say that Professor Malamed, in fact, is an Orthodox Jew himself, if Rabbi Sarfati, you didn't know it. And he goes on to say, by banning the professor from the complex of the synagogue, and as such not even allowing him to join a minyan in our synagogue, you have created an enormous chilul Hashem, desecration of God's name, making Orthodox Judaism a farce in the eyes of the many. You have done all of us who fight for the honor of Judaism a great disservice. Shame on you. You have all the right in the world to disagree with Professor Malamed, yet it behooves you to invite him to discuss his intentions and the contents of the film and possibly contribute to his endeavor. I hope the lay leaders of the Portuguese-Spanish community in Amsterdam will take the necessary steps to undo this great damage. I think it's not accidental that he refers to the lay leaders, because as I mentioned last week, it was the lay leaders of the shul in Amsterdam, in the Portuguese synagogue, Portuguese-Spanish synagogue in which Spinoza grew up. The lay leaders were the ones who had the authority to issue the cherem. The rabbis, I'm almost certain, drafted the cherem statement, but the ones who were in charge of whether or not to issue the ban were the lay leaders, and Rabbi Cardozo is saying the lay leaders should remedy this continuing dishonor and embrace the thought of Spinoza again, even if we don't agree with everything he wrote. Okay, so I'm going to pause briefly there. Does anyone have any questions about any leftover questions from last week or anything that I just mentioned? And I'd like to pause just briefly before we really launch into the topic of Spinoza's biblical criticism.
Mark?
Yes, Sheila.
I just wanted to say one thing that I thought I would add from last week's commentary. I remember first learning about Spinoza when I was in college and took a course on great philosophers. And the professor made it a point to single out Spinoza, saying that he was the one person whom mathematicians and logicians had been able to go into and to take his writings and actually mathematically prove his logic. I thought that was a fascinating commentary on Spinoza, and it seems tragic that we would deny somebody who was such an extraordinary thinker when we embrace people like Einstein, who surely did not go along with every single possible facet of what traditional Judaism believes, and a whole variety of others. There seems to me to be something very vindictive in this process.
Yeah, I'll just comment briefly on that, Sheila. First of all, we're going to focus on the Theological Political Treatise of Spinoza. His other great work is called The Ethics, and in the Ethics, which I've only looked at, I've studied more, the treatise that we'll look at today. The Ethics is very complicated, very difficult to sort of get through, but he uses what is actually called the geometric method, Spinoza. He lays out his arguments in mathematical fashion along the lines that you just mentioned. So Spinoza is known as a very sort of rigorous logical thinker, and that's probably what your professor had in mind. Again, I'm not going to go into the ethics and his metaphysics that were very important philosophically in the Western tradition. But yes, he is known for that, that mathematical logical rigor. And yes, there is sort of a double standard applied to Spinoza. Others, like Einstein, who was a fan of Spinoza, it's because Spinoza really came first. He really launched the modern period. Some people blame him for the disaffection that some Jews had from the Jewish tradition as a result of Spinoza's impact. So there is a double standard. So there's a mixed reaction as to whether we should embrace him today or not. Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. It seems what you're presenting is that the Portuguese Spanish community in Amsterdam was monolithic, that there was only one sect that distributed the way Judaism was practiced. Were there not other, offshoots or budding nouveau sects as well? Because this was the time after the Enlightenment, I think, and they were, these thoughts were entering into the society. So I would think to the other sects that had similar offshoots.
Right. So Hal, the answer is, the short answer is really no. I mentioned last week there was another heretic who espoused some principles that were similar to Spinoza and may have been sort of a precursor to Spinoza, but there was not great diversity in the Jewish community. It had to be, first of all, this is 2 centuries before Jewish denominations emerged. We're talking about the 17th century. It was not until the 19th century that Reform and conservative Judaism emerged. So Spinoza was really the one who sort of created the path toward denominational Judaism. So yes, there were other very limited dissenting voices within the Jewish community, but those were stamped out pretty quickly. The community felt it had to create or preserve uniformity so that the community could grow internally and that it would not present a problem externally. So you're correct that in the Christian world, there was a little bit more diversity. But again, the Christian ecclesiastical authorities were also very harsh in their condemnation of Spinoza and other heretics of the sort. So there was not a lot of diversity in the Jewish community. That would only emerge a couple of centuries later, in no small part because of Spinoza's radical thinking in the 17th century. Okay, why don't I move on, because I do want to cover some really interesting, what I think is some very interesting material about biblical criticism that was launched by Spinoza and that is still being pursued today, including by observant Jews who I think were influenced by Spinoza's thinking. Okay, the first text we're going to look at is sort of the framework for evaluating the heretical, radical nature of Spinoza's thinking about the Torah. This text is from Maimonides. We saw that Ben Gurion referred to Spinoza as the greatest Jewish thinker between the redaction of the Bible and Einstein. Most traditional Jews would probably choose Maimonides as that greatest thinker, or certainly among a handful of the greatest Jewish thinkers over the 2,000 years. This text is from his commentary on the Mishnah. This is the famous Perek Chelek, his introduction to the 10th chapter of Sanhedrin, in which Maimonides, the Rambam, sets out the 13 principles of faith that have become quite important in Orthodox traditional Judaism. The relevant one here is the 8th principle. These 13 principles have become sort of popularized and became normative in part through the their incorporation into the Yigdal prayer that we at Or Zarua say on Friday evenings. That prayer at the end of the service reflects the 13 principles. I will say what we're about to read is really an expansive view of the revelation of the Torah and of the divinity of both the written and the oral Torahs. But as Professor Marc Shapiro, in his really great book, The Limits of Orthodox Theology, has pointed out, there was not consensus in the medieval period about Maimonides. He's really become sort of normative only over the last 2 or 3 centuries. And at the time, there was, in fact, getting back to Hal's point, more diversity of thought within sort of traditional parameters about the divinity of the Torah. Almost all traditional Jews believed that the Torah was divinely inspired, but what that exactly meant was open to dispute. And Professor Shapiro argues, and I agree, that even Maimonides probably didn't quite believe what he wrote here, because he writes other things in other places in his writings, including in his famous The Guide to the Perplexed. So this principle was not universally accepted. It's likely to be taken with a grain of salt because even Maimonides probably didn't believe what he was writing. He probably believed that this statement was really designed for the masses whose faith was precarious and fragile and about whom Maimonides was concerned. But this is a very sort of aggressive, expansive view of the divinity of the Torah. He writes, the 8th principle is that the Torah came from heaven. We are to believe that the whole Torah that is in our hands today is the Torah that was brought down to Moses. So that's a very expansive statement. So he's saying the Torah that we read from today, from the scroll, is exactly the same in all respects, in all detail, as what Moses got from God and that Moses delivered to the children of Israel at Mount Sinai and in the desert. And that all of it is from God by the transmission that is called speech metaphorically. We do not know exactly how it reached us, but only that it came to us through Moses, who acted like a scribe taking dictation. So this has become the normative view that Moses had no discretion. He wasn't making stuff up and he wasn't paraphrasing God. He was acting sort of as a secretary. Further, there is no distinction, Maimonides says, between, on the one hand, and then he quotes 2 verses that some of us may think are not particularly important. They're just about genealogies in Genesis. So those are seemingly unimportant biblical verses. And on the other hand, I am the Lord your God. That's the opening statement of the 10 Commandments. And hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. I hope you recognize that as the statement of the Shema. So Maimonides is saying there's no qualitative difference in terms of importance or divinity between, actually, let me tweak that. He does think that certain verses are more important in terms of teaching us truth, but in terms of status, in terms of divinity and divine origin, there's no distinction between genealogical verses and the 10 Commandments and the Shema. All Torah verses are from the mouth of the Almighty. Everything is the Torah of God, perfect, pure, holy, and true. Further, and here I think he and others were responding to the Muslim concept of tahrif, which that concept, it's not universal in Islam, but it was espoused by some significant Muslim thinkers at the time that Jews falsified the revelation from God. Remember that Muslims believe that the Hebrew Bible is sacred, but they believe that Jews falsified or engaged in sort of fraud with respect to aspects of the revelation. So Maimonides implicitly is responding to that. Anyone who says that Moses wrote some passages on his own is regarded by our sages as an atheist of the worst kind of heretic, because he tries to distinguish essence from trivia in the Torah. Such a heretic claims that some historical passages or stories are trivial inventions of Moses and not divine revelation. But the sages said that if one accepts his revelation, the whole Torah, with the exception of even one verse, which Moses himself and not God composed, he is referred to in the verse of spurning the word of God and is heretical. So Maimonides is saying, you're a heretic if you believe that any passage in the 5 books of Torah, from Genesis through the end of Deuteronomy in the Hebrew Bible, were composed by Moses, not at the explicit, direct, specific direction of God. And he adds further, that's just with respect to the written Torah, the Torah shebichtav. And the next paragraph is has been the subject of many of my classes through the years. Similarly, the authoritative interpretation of the Torah, as it has been handed down, is also the word of God. The sukkah we build today, or the lulav, shofar, tzitzit, tefillin, and other forms that we use, replicate exactly those that God showed Moses and which Moses faithfully described for us. So the oral Torah too, or much of the oral Torah, in terms of how we actually implement and fulfill the word of the written Torah, was also revealed by God at Mount Sinai and in the desert. So all of that too, both Torahs, the oral Torah and the written Torah, are divine down to the last letter, essentially, is what Maimonides is saying. So again, that is not, Maimonides' 8th principle is not dispositive in the medieval Jewish world, but it has come to be known as normative. And many Orthodox Jews today, I think, sort of ignorantly think that all Jews have always believed this. That's not the case, but this has become, because of Maimonides' stature within the tradition, a very important framework for understanding heresy with respect to the divinity of the Torah. Now, as I've mentioned, Spinoza didn't buy into the 8th principle, and we're gonna see why. But what I'm focused on in particular is the sacred, divine, not just sacred, but divine nature of the written text of the Torah, meaning the biblical text that is in our possession today is exactly the same as was dictated by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. So the scroll that we read from at Or Zarua yesterday, and that is read from in synagogues around the world, matches in all detail with the Torah that was revealed by God to Moses. Now, Spinoza, and we're going to get into the sort of arc of his biblical criticism and the really momentous impact that he had on the study of the Bible. When he read the Torah, and I'm referring more generally to the Tanakh, so going beyond the Pentateuch, going beyond the first 5 books of Moses. To be clear, the Jewish tradition does not necessarily believe that the rest of the Bible, the rest of Tanakh, is divine in exactly the same way, but the tradition certainly assigns the rest of Tanakh a sacredness, and most traditional Jews believe that most of it was at least divinely inspired. But Spinoza read these books as one would read any other book, and saw that there were all sorts of deficiencies and defects in the Bible. So again, this is from later in the Tanakh, but I think the same principles applied, certainly for Spinoza. The way he read the book of Samuel was the same way he would read the book of Genesis or Exodus or Deuteronomy. And this is just an example, but you'll see that Spinoza comments on it. It's illustrative of his approach to the Bible more generally. If you open the book of Samuel, chapter 13, I'll just read the Hebrew. For those of you who are sensitive to the Hebrew, you'll hear that there's something wrong with the Hebrew. Ben Shana Shaul b'molcho u'shtei shanim malach al Yisrael. And you see, I didn't make this up. This is the translation that I got from Sepharia. It's the same as the JPS translation. Saul was blank years old when he became king, and he reigned over Israel 2 years. Now that's a really problematic verse because it's seemingly defective in at least 2 ways. It seems to be missing a word in the Hebrew, literally missing some word, the number. It says Saul was blank years old, and literally the Hebrew says that King Saul, who was the first king of the Israelite people, he didn't last very long because he was deposed, and King David took over. But this literally says that King Saul was 1 year old when he took over the kingship, and that he only reigned for 2 years. So it's defective in claiming that he was 1 year old, or that it doesn't provide his age. And it says that he only reigned for 2 years, when we know from the text of the Tanakh itself that he reigned for more. So it's a really problematic, sort of mysterious text that seems like it's defective textually in some way. And here I brought a verse from Exodus. This is the way Hebrew should read. Moshe ben shmonim shana, ve'Aaron ben shalosh ushmonim shana, ve'dabram el paro. Moses was 80 years old and Aaron 83 years old when they spoke with Pharaoh. There, the Hebrew is complete. There are no missing words. That's what the verse in Samuel should have looked like. So there we have this problematic verse in Samuel. The Talmud and the rabbis, I just want to be clear, the rabbis were really skilled, excellent readers of the biblical text. If nothing else, if you study classical Jewish sources, you will become more sensitive to the nuances of biblical texts and rabbinic sources, because the rabbis themselves were really close readers, very critical readers, but they were unwilling to say, oh, the biblical text is simply defective, or that it was written by someone else who was limited in capacity. So in Tractate Yoma, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, it says, it is written, Saul was 1 year old when he began to reign. So that's a quotation from the verse in Samuel. And I said, that's literally what the verse says, that King Saul was 1 year old, which can't be right, because the text itself said that he was appointed when he was a young man. So the rabbis are forced to read the text not according to its plain sense, but to read it metaphorically. They give it a midrashic, figurative reading. Rav Huna said, the verse means that when he began to reign, he was like a 1 year old. Ke ven shana, that one letter ke means he wasn't one, he was as if he was 1 year old, in that he had never tasted the taste of sin. Shelo ta'am ta'amche. So the rabbis, because of their assumptions about the text, that it was at least divinely inspired, and it can't simply be defective textually, they had to read the text figuratively, metaphorically. So that's not the way Spinoza thought we should read it. His comment on that verse from Samuel is that the text is mutilated, cannot be doubted by anyone who has the slightest acquaintance with the Hebrew language. Who can fail to see that the number of years of Saul's age when he began to reign has been omitted? And I do not think that anyone can doubt, too, that the narrative itself requires a greater number for the years of his reign. So Spinoza is saying the text is defective in two ways. He was obviously older than a year old, or he was some age that the text does not provide when he began his reign, and he reigned certainly, according to the plain meaning of the Tanakh itself, he reigned for more than 2 years. And Spinoza is saying, look, let's read the text as it presents itself, and it is mutilated. And what he means by that, it is defective, deficient in some way. And again, he was expert in the Hebrew language. And I would say, if as Spinoza read the Bible, he read it as he would any other book. If you read it on those terms, isn't Spinoza right? There's really no way to, a Hebrew reader can look at that verse and think that there's not something wrong with it. So that was a specific example of Spinoza's biblical criticism with respect to the book, a verse in the book of Samuel. Here is a strong statement from the Theological Political Treatise about Spinoza's method of reading scripture, reading the Hebrew Bible more generally. And basically, he is saying, read it what I'll call naturalistically. Read it not supernaturally, not with all sorts of assumptions and premises related to our conception or our preconception, that God revealed this text, but read the Bible, give it the same integrity of interpretation as you would any other text, and read it sort of naturally, free of external assumptions and preconceptions. He writes in the treatise, I say that the method of interpreting scripture does not differ at all from the method of interpreting nature, but agrees with it completely. For the method of interpreting nature consists above all in putting together a history of nature from which, as from certain data, we infer the definitions of natural things. So read the Bible scientifically. Sheila mentioned before that the sort of mathematical rigor of Spinoza's thought. Spinoza is saying, read it scientifically, read it mathematically, read it critically as you would any other book. In the same way, to interpret scripture, it is necessary to prepare a straightforward history of scripture and to infer from it the mind of scripture's authors by legitimate inferences as from certain data and principles. For in this way, everyone, provided he has admitted no prior principles or data for interpreting scripture and discussing it than those drawn from scripture itself and its history. So just look at the text and understand its history, free of prior assumptions and presumptions, will always proceed without danger of error. And he gives an example. The Bible gives the sense that God is sort of was on fire in a couple of places. To know whether Moses believed that God is fire, we must in no way infer our answer from the fact that this sentence, taken literally, agrees with reason or is contrary to it. Instead, we must rely only on other statements that Moses himself makes. This becomes later a very important principle of biblical criticism. Take the Bible seriously. If it says something, let's see if let's assume that it really believes what it says. Let's not conform our understanding of the Bible to external standards or assumptions. And then he goes on to criticize Maimonides in particular. And I'll say that we will see next week that Spinoza really admired Maimonides in many respects and was greatly influenced by Maimonides in terms of his conception of God. But he does take Maimonides to task in terms of interpreting the Bible, because as we saw in the eighth principle, Maimonides makes certain assumptions that it was divinely revealed. And in addition, Maimonides holds up the truths of reason, of rational thought, as the sort of external standard against which we must understand and interpret the Bible. The Bible must conform to truths of reason and rational thinking, or else we have to reinterpret the Bible. That's what Maimonides believes, as reflected in the Guide to the Perplexed. So Spinoza criticizes Maimonides for that and writes, Maimonides assumes that it is legitimate for us to explain away and distort the words of Scripture to accord with our preconceived opinions, to deny the literal or plain meaning, the pshat, as we understand it in Jewish tradition, and change it into something else, even when it is perfectly plain and absolutely clear. So Spinoza is saying, as do many modern biblical scholars, take the Bible on its own terms. Don't assume that it has to conform to some philosophical truth or to some preconceived notion that it is divinely revealed, but read it on its own terms. That's how we'll best understand the Bible. And even more broadly, this is another statement from the treatise. Spinoza, what he really has as his target are the ecclesiastical authorities, both within the Jewish community and probably even more in the Christian community, who are dictating what is considered to be truth. And what Spinoza really wanted to do was separate, in a respect, separate church from state and make sure that theologians, ecclesiastical authorities of the church, in the case of Holland, didn't dictate what happened in politics and philosophy. That theologians can do what they want to do, but they shouldn't dictate the terms of politics or philosophy. And he writes, on every side, we hear men saying that the Bible is the word of God, teaching mankind true blessedness or the path to salvation. We see that nearly all men parade their own ideas as God's word, their chief aim being to compel others to think as they do, while using religion as a pretext. We see, I say, that the chief concern of theologians on the whole has been to extort from the Holy Scripture. And here he means, I think, both what was referred to as the Old Testament and the New Testament. So both within the Jewish community and within the Christian community, their own arbitrarily invented ideas for which they claim divine authority. They ascribe to the Holy Spirit, and that sounds Christian, but it also has Jewish resonance, the Ruach HaKodesh in Hebrew, whatever their wild fantasies have invented, and devote their utmost strength and enthusiasm to defending it. So, by the way, I mentioned earlier that his other great book, The Ethics, is quite dense and hard to get through. The treatise is not. It's quite straightforward and intelligible. Spinoza says what he means, and he really wants to put theologians who are trying to dictate to other people the terms of how to interpret the Bible and everything else. He wants to put them on the sidelines. They can do what they want, but they shouldn't interfere with the conduct and thinking of other people. So this is true also of biblical criticism, that let's read the Bible on its own terms without preconceived theological assumptions, and we'll learn about the Bible and we'll be free to think what we want about it based on the evidence that we find. Okay, so that's his, in broad principles, Spinoza's theory of reading the Bible, is his theory of biblical criticism. And again, he really launched the whole world of modern biblical criticism that is still ongoing almost 400 years later. But let's return, what I want to do is return to Maimonides' eighth principle. Recall that I said, and we read, that Maimonides' eighth principle says that the text of the Torah that we have today is exactly the same as was dictated by God to Moses at Mount Sinai, or in the course of the desert wanderings. So essentially, Moses was the scribe who wrote the Bible. And to think that any letter, any verse or passage or portion of the Bible was written by anyone else it constitutes heresy. According to the literal terms of the eighth principle, again, I'm not sure Maimonides really believed that. I don't think he did. And we'll see that there's evidence suggesting that he did not. But even within classical Jewish sources, and one of the reasons I say that I don't think even Maimonides believed the quite expansive scope of the way he phrased the eighth principle, is because he was aware that even in the Talmud, there is an opinion that suggests that Moses did not write the entire Bible. The Talmud, this is from the Babylonian Talmud, which of course Maimonides believed was authoritative. Moses wrote his own book, meaning the Torah, and this is sort of interesting, the portion of Bilam in the Torah, that's the episode of the prophet Bilam, who was hired by King Balak to curse the Jews. Includes the famous story of the talking donkey. And so this reference is because it is sort of mysterious as to how Moses would know certain things about Bilam's experience, but the rabbis think that through prophecy, through revelation by God to Moses, he was able to write the entire Torah, including the episode of Bilam in the book of Numbers, and the book of Job. So they ascribe authorship of Moses to the book of Job, that comes much later in the Tanakh. But they say, and here's a very important caveat that creates an opening to the biblical criticism that Spinoza exploited and that he expanded, and that led to the modern world of biblical criticism, the Talmud. So almost 2,000 years ago, the Talmud embodies this opinion that Joshua wrote his own book. So Joshua wrote the book of Joshua and 8 verses in the Torah. So the Hebrew says, Yoshua katav sifro ushmona psukim shabbat Torah. So even the Talmud says, contrary to Maimonides' eighth principle, that 8 verses of the Torah, and we'll see that's the end of the Torah, Joshua wrote them, and not Moses. So that seems to contradict, to flout the literal terms of Maimonides' eighth principle about the divinity and Mosaic authorship of the Torah. And so this is what the Talmud is referring to. This is the end of the Torah, the last chapter, chapter 34 of the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. I won't read it all, but this is essentially about Moses' death. And it starts out by saying, Vayal Moshe Arvot Moav El Har Nevo. Moses went up from the steps of Moab to Mount Nevo, and God showed him the promised land. So this says Moses went up, he never came down. So he went up, he never came down. God showed him the promised land. Moses never sort of came down and said farewell to the people. And in verse 5, it says, so Moses, the servant of God, died there. Vayamot sham Moshe Eved Hashem be'eretz Moav al pi Hashem. So Moses died. It goes on to say God buried him. He was 120. The Israelites mourned him. Joshua took over from him, and he too was filled with the spirit of wisdom. And it sort of the Torah ends that about the greatness of Moses. But this last chapter of Deuteronomy records that Moses went up to a mountain, died there, never came down. And the Talmud is saying these 8 verses. So starting from verse 5, which indicates that Moses died, through the end of the Torah, through verse 12, had to be written by someone else, because although there's another tradition in the Talmud that says Moses wrote this by prophecy through the revelation by God, and he wrote it with a tear because he was sad about the fact that he was dying, but he nevertheless wrote it like a secretary taking dictation, according to Maimonides. But there is another tradition in the Talmud that says, no, dead men don't speak. I mean, even this tradition in the Talmud is saying, let's take the Bible on its own terms, like Spinoza would say much later. And dead people don't talk. They don't write things. So someone else had to write it, and they attribute authorship to Joshua. So that tradition in the Talmud, which preceded Maimonides by many centuries, seems to contradict the plain terms of his very influential 8th principle of faith. I want to give you, we're going to transition now to other evidence that Spinoza later drew on in emerging with a quite expansive view of the Bible as a human fallible document that was not authored by Moses. I'll give something away. He believed it was authored by Ezra the scribe in the 6th century BCE, so several centuries after Moses. But there is other evidence that Spinoza marshals, including from the great, and again, the subtitle of the class is Jewish Roots, Spinoza's Jewish Roots and Legacy. I'm focused now on Spinoza's Jewish roots in classical Jewish sources. The 2 people he quotes and refers to in the treatise, the Theological Political Treatise, are Maimonides. We already saw that he criticizes Maimonides, but also credits Maimonides, at least implicitly, with some important philosophical conclusions about the conception of God. But he explicitly draws upon and praises Abraham ibn Ezra. So he's referred to by traditional Jews often as the Ibn Ezra. He's so important. And Ibn Ezra is really bedrock classical Judaism. His classical Jewish credentials cannot be doubted. But Ibn Ezra was an early Bible critic, a very sort of innovative, original thinker of the Bible. And Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 11th century, he believed that certain passages of the Bible were likely not written by Moses. Again, contrary to what Maimonides espoused in the 8th principle. By the way, Ibn Ezra lived from 1089 to 1192, so he lived a very good long life, 103 years. And his life is chronologically significant. He overlapped with both Rashi and with Rambam, with both Rashi, the great biblical commentator and Talmudic commentator, and Maimonides. He lived sort of in between them. So he would not have agreed with all the literal terms of Maimonides' 8th principle. And one of the sort of building blocks of biblical criticism for both as an early biblical critic for both Ibn Ezra and later for Spinoza, who drew upon Ibn Ezra explicitly in the treatise and praised him for the way he interpreted the Bible. Genesis chapter 12 says, Avram, so he was known as Abram, this is before his name was changed to Abraham. Abram passed the land as far as the site of Shechem at the terebinth of Moreh. The terebinth is a large tree. And the Canaanites were then in the land, the Haknaani az ba'aretz. And the really important word there in the Hebrew is az. The Canaanites, or the Canaanite people, were then in the land. If you just read that as a sort of naturalistically, it sounds like the narrator is saying, oh, when Abram passed the land, that's when the Canaanites were still there. But today, when I'm writing, the Canaanites are no longer here. And what that seems to imply is that at the time that this verse was written, the author, the narrator, seems to be saying, this now is a time that Canaanites are absent from the land, which seems to imply this verse was written after the conquest of the land by Joshua, after the death of Moses. So it seems to imply a perspective that postdates a time that Moses was alive, and therefore that Moses could have written the verse. And in fact, that's the inference, the conclusion that Ibn Ezra in the 11th century drew from this verse. He writes on this verse, it is possible that the Canaanites seized the land of Canaan from some other tribe at that time. So he says, yes, it is conceivable that there is a way that you could read the verse so that it doesn't suggest a later authorship. But he writes, should this interpretation be incorrect, then there is a secret meaning to the text. The Hebrew, "Inenu ken yesh lo sod," let the one who understands it, meaning the secret meaning, remain silent. Now, Ibn Ezra, I believe, and most scholars believe, that Ibn Ezra actually believed this second interpretation, that he believed there was a secret meaning to the text, meaning this verse was written by someone other than Moses. And this is a verse, by the way, not encompassed within the scope of that Talmudic tradition that Joshua wrote the last 8 verses of the Bible. Ibn Ezra is saying, well, you know what? If you read this text carefully, it looks like this text was written perhaps by someone else, but don't publicize this because it would, just as Maimonides was concerned about the simple faith of the common Jew, I think Ibn Ezra was similarly concerned and anxious not to upset the faith of common Jews. So only for sort of the intellectual elite, let's keep this secret to ourselves. And Ibn Ezra, on the first couple of verses of Deuteronomy, expands the scope of passages that it seems clear he believed were written by authors after Moses, so that passages in the Torah, in the Bible, in the Pentateuch, that were not of Mosaic authorship and therefore defied the literal terms of Maimonides' 8th principle, and that Spinoza would rely on to expand the scale of biblical criticism in reading the entire Pentateuch as something that was written by authors different from and beyond Moses. Ibn Ezra writes, the verse 3 of Deuteronomy says, Moses addressed the Israelites in accordance with the instructions the Lord had given him for them beyond the Jordan. So it seems to be, again, the sort of narrator of the text seems to be saying Moses was giving these laws when he was on the other side of the Jordan. But now this perspective implies we're on, so that would be the east side of the Jordan. Now we crossed the Jordan, now we're on the west side. That must mean that the narrative was from the perspective of someone who wrote this or who conveyed this by revelation after the time of Moses, after the conquest of the promised land, when they were already on the other side of the Jordan. Moses notably did not cross the Jordan. But this phrase beyond the Jordan seems to imply a post-Mosaic perspective. And then he goes on, if you understand the secret of the 12, Sod Ashnei Masar. So we just saw that in Genesis, Ibn Ezra refers to the secret that he doesn't want to be publicized broadly in the community. Now he's referring to a secret of the 12, which seems to be referring to the 12, not just the 8, as the Talmud suggests, but the 12 verses in the concluding chapter of Deuteronomy that tell of Moses' death. Remember, that chapter starts with Moses going up to the mountain. He never came back down. He never had an opportunity to convey any of what he was experiencing to the Israelites once he went up to the mountain. So Ibn Ezra is saying, start at the beginning of when he went up to the mountain. That's all 12 verses there were not written by Moses. And he goes on to give several other examples. I'll just focus for a moment because we have limited time on this one. On the mount of the Lord it shall be revealed. And by the way, here's the first one that we just looked at. The Canaanites were then in the land. The second one, on the mount of the Lord it shall be revealed. Ibn Ezra points out that the mount of the Lord, which we usually think of as Har HaMoriah in Jerusalem, that's not the way it's referred to in the rest of Deuteronomy. In the rest of the books of the Torah, it's referred to as the mountain that God will choose. The mount of the Lord seems to be a specific reference to the mountain on which the temple was built later. So he says, if you understand the secret of the 12 and also of these various other passages that suggest non-Mosaic authorship, then you will recognize the truth. Takir ha'emet. So again, Ibn Ezra is very nuanced, very secretive, somewhat enigmatic about his reading, but he is understood by almost everyone as suggesting that it's not just the end of the book of the Torah in the last chapter of Deuteronomy that sort of dictates that there was a different author, a non-Mosaic author, but these other various passages, even starting in the book of Genesis, were written by someone other than Moses. Here's another example, another building block for Ibn Ezra. This is a reference, a passage in Leviticus. It refers to the lots of the two goats on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. We read this on Yom Kippur Day. Leviticus says, and he, the high priest, shall place lots upon the two goats, one marked for God and the other marked for Azazel. You know, we're sort of used to hearing Azazel, but this is actually the only reference in the entire Torah to the word Azazel. It doesn't appear anywhere else in the 5 books of Moses, and therefore it is of sort of mysterious origin. And Rabbi Shlomo ben Shmuel HaTzarfati, who wrote what is called a super commentary to the commentary of Ibn Ezra. There were many commentaries written on Ibn Ezra's commentary and sort of elaborating on them, expanding them, and agreeing with them largely, including these sort of early threads of biblical criticism. He wrote, this rabbi in the 13th century wrote, do not be surprised that Azazel is written in Aramaic. So he's saying this word is Aramaic rather than Hebrew, for Moses did not write this verse. This is a secret that we share, that Moses did not compose this verse, but someone else did. And then he says, look, Ibn Ezra already referred to this in the passage that we just read above about the secret of the 12. So this Sod Shnei Masar, the secret of the 12, that encompasses within its scope other passages in the Torah that similarly were not written by Moses, was also taken up by these are traditional Jews, these are fully observant Jews who could live with the fact that Moses, again, contrary to the literal terms of Maimonides, is the 8th principle, that Moses did not author every last verse and letter of the Torah, that there are passages that were authored by others. I've gathered here a few more sort of building blocks from within the biblical text that Spinoza building on Ibn Ezra, exploited for purposes of his naturalistic reading of the Bible on its own terms, leading to his conclusion that no, Moses did not write the Torah. Genesis 36:31 says, these are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. Lifnei Moloch Melech Livnei Israel. Now, traditional commentators who sort of presupposed that the Torah was written exclusively and comprehensively by Moses at the direction of God, they have to interpret king, because at the time of Genesis, there were no kings in Israel. This is the time of our forefathers, centuries before any king reigned in Israel. So they have to interpret the word king figuratively, metaphorically, just like we saw earlier that the Talmud had to do with respect to that defective verse in the book of Samuel. They interpret king as referring either to God or to Moses. So the traditional commentators are forced to read this sort of figuratively, because the perspective seems to be of the author seems to be someone in whose time there were kings in Israel, meaning at least at the time of no earlier than the time of King Saul, many centuries after Moses. So this is another building block of Spinoza's biblical criticism, that this verse in Genesis seems to have been written by someone who postdated Moses by many centuries. Another one, again, this is from the book of Genesis, the first book of the Torah. It's Avram was trying to fight against some neighboring kings, and it says he went in pursuit as far as Dan, Vayirdof ad Dan, and readers of the Bible familiar with the story know that that word Dan didn't come into the world, didn't come into relevance until much later after Abraham, until the generation of the sons, the children of Jacob. Dan was one of the children of Jacob. Dan later became a tribe, and the tribe of Dan became known by their ancestor, and it was a reference to the city and geographical region of the tribe of Dan. But that didn't come into existence until generations later after Avram. So it seems to be what Spinoza and others refer to as sort of a textual anachronism. We've seen that already about the Canaanites were then in the land. There seem to be anachronisms in the Bible where things are referenced that really shouldn't be referenced until a much later time. The Bible seems to incorporate references from the perspective of later post-Mosaic periods. The final building block that I want to mention is the importance of Ezra the scribe. Ezra the scribe lived in the 6th century BCE, so several centuries after Moses, but he is a really important figure in Jewish tradition. There's a book of Tanakh named after Ezra, and he's often paired with Nehemiah. But Ezra is ascribed very significant importance in the history of sort of rehabilitating the Jewish tradition, the plain terms of verses in his own book that he is presumed to have authored. Here is one. For Ezra had dedicated himself to study the Torah of the Lord so as to observe it and to teach laws and rules to Israel. Even classical Jewish sources seem to attribute Ezra the role of sort of restoring something about the text of the Torah and the practice of Jewish law to the Jewish community. They had gone astray through idolatry, and the Tanakh is replete with examples of the Jews defying God's word and straying on the path of idol worship, which is, as I mentioned last week, the sin par excellence in the Torah. And Ezra is credited with sort of bringing the community back when even the text of the Torah seems to have been abandoned, or at least lost to some degree, and reinstituting the proper and correct practice of Jewish law in the community. This was the time when the second temple was built. The community was fragile, and Ezra is credited with getting the people back on the right path. This next text amplifies on that very important role given by classical Jewish sources to Ezra the scribe in rehabilitating the Jewish tradition, including the biblical text. And this is really a remarkable text from a classical Jewish source, Bamidbar Rabbah. There are what is referred to here, you see in the italics, puncta extraordinaria. And I assume many of you are not aware of this, but for those of you who are Torah readers or very familiar with the Bible and with biblical studies, you will know that there are, I think, 9 or 10 instances in the Pentateuch of words that usually have dots above them, so that they are the extraordinary points. This is the Latin phrase that is used by scholars. Words in the Torah that have points above them. And biblical scholars debate about what the words mean. But even those points, these puncta extraordinaria, go back many, many centuries, back to this. They were around at the time of this rabbinic source about 1500 years ago. And that source says, some give another reason why the dots, these puncta extraordinaria, are inserted into the Torah. So if you're reading from the Torah scroll, you will see these dots. Just an example is in Genesis chapter 33, verse 4, it says that Esau kissed Jacob. The Hebrew word vayishakehu, which means and he kissed him, has dots over it. And readers of the Bible, including traditional Jews, have wondered, why are there dots over it? And the tradition says, oh, they're dots because perhaps the kiss was not sincere, it wasn't genuine. Perhaps it even indicates that that Esau bit Jacob. So there are various reasons, but they have to account for why these dots are there. And this source says Ezra was the one who put the dots there. Ezra reasoned thus: if Elijah, Eliyahu the prophet, comes and asks, why have you written these words? Meaning, why have you included these suspect words that have the dots over them in the text of the Torah? I, meaning Ezra, shall respond, that is why I dotted these passages. Meaning, yeah, I wasn't sure whether these words really belonged here. I had suspicions that they did not belong. So I put these dots over them to indicate that their rightful place in the Bible is suspect, is uncertain. And if he says to me, you have done well in having written them, meaning, no, these words belonged, then I shall erase the dots over them. What this text seems to be saying, or at least implying very strongly, and I'm not the only one who says this, we'll see there are other modern, traditionally oriented Jewish scholars who believe that this passage is indicating that Ezra had the discretion, the authority to edit the Torah. It's really sort of, from a traditional perspective, sort of a breathtaking passage, because it gives Ezra, it seems to imply that Ezra had the authority to take out words, to redact or edit the biblical text. So again, contrary to Maimonides' position that every last letter, you have to believe that every last letter was precisely dictated by God to Moses, or else you are a heretic. This passage, like the other Talmudic passage we saw earlier that explicitly says, no, Joshua wrote some words of the Torah, and even Ezra later said, it's not just those 8 verses, it's in fact 12, and then there are a bunch of other passages. He implies that were written by people other than Moses and people who post-dated Moses. This passage is saying Ezra the scribe, centuries after Moses, actually had the discretion to modify the text of the Torah. So Spinoza takes these building blocks of biblical criticism, these threads in classical Jewish sources that started in the Talmud and that continued through this sort of line in Jewish intellectual history through Ibn Ezra and the commentators who wrote super commentaries on Ibn Ezra's commentary on the Torah, and other rabbinic sources that seem to suggest that people other than Moses had the authority to sort of modify the biblical text, Spinoza took all of those building blocks. So these were the Jewish roots of his biblical criticism, and expanded them greatly because, again, his posture was, I'm going to read the Bible like I read every other book. And if you read it naturalistically, free of sort of supernatural presuppositions, you'll see that there's abundant evidence that it could not have been written by Moses. In fact, it was written, probably written, Spinoza concludes, by Ezra the scribe. And by the way, Ezra died before he had time to fully edit it properly. That's why there are all sorts of sort of residual defects in the text. There are repetitions, there are omissions, there are chronological inconsistencies. There are still problems in the text, but Ezra did as good a job as he could do. But he was the author of the Torah and other books of Tanakh centuries after Moses. In the treatise, Spinoza writes, I will begin, so he says what he doesn't believe in, with the received opinions concerning the true authors of the sacred books, and in the first place speak of the author of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, who is almost universally supposed to have been Moses. The Pharisees, now he's been criticized by Jewish thinkers and Jewish scholars for referring to Jews. He doesn't just mean the ancient Pharisees, he's referring to the Jews of his own community in the 17th century in Amsterdam. So he refers to them sort of disparagingly and in a way that sort of appeals to what he thought would be the Christian audience that he was appealing to. The Pharisees are so firmly convinced of his identity, meaning that Moses wrote it, that they account as a heretic anyone who differs from them on the subject. So meaning they account people who disagree with them, like me, a heretic. Abraham ibn Ezra, and here is where Spinoza explicitly references Spinoza and very highly praises him. Ibn Ezra, a man of enlightened intelligence and significant learning, was the first, so far as I know, to address a different opinion, but dared not express his meaning openly, rather confining himself to obscure hints that I shall not hesitate to elucidate, thus throwing full light on the subject. So Spinoza says, yes, I learned from Ibn Ezra. I built on his opinion that there are non-Mosaic passages in the Torah. But while Ibn Ezra wanted to keep that a secret among a small group of his intellectual friends so as not to disrupt or undermine the simple faith of common Jews, I'm not going to hesitate to tell the truth about the Bible. And he goes on to marshal all sorts of evidence building on Ibn Ezra. And later he writes, we have explained Ibn Ezra's opinion and also clarified the passages of the Pentateuch he cites to prove it. However, Ibn Ezra does not call attention to every instance of evidence showing non-Mosaic authorship, or even the primary ones. There remain many of greater importance that may be cited. And I've skipped it, but there are pages in the Theological Political Treatise in which Spinoza lays out much more evidence that he believes shows that the Torah was not written by Moses. From the foregoing, it is clear beyond a shadow of doubt, and when you read the treatise, it's quite compelling, that the Pentateuch was not written by Moses, but rather by someone who lived many generations after Moses. We conclude that all the books of the Hebrew Bible that we have so far considered are the works of other hands, meaning not the authors that the classical sources generally attribute to those works, and that their contents are narrated as ancient history, meaning if you read these books of the Bible on their own terms, as you would any other book, it seems that they were written by narrators writing centuries after the events that they describe. I cannot imagine that anyone but Ezra the scribe was the writer of these books. So he credits Ezra with authorship of the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, as well as other books as well. But again, his editing was not completed and is therefore imperfect. And what remains in our hands today has various deficiencies that require additional explanation. I'm going to stop there. I have a few more passages that I'll continue just at the beginning of next week's session, laying out in brief terms the legacy of Spinoza's biblical criticism. I think he has left an imprint. Well, he certainly has left a massive imprint on the general non-Jewish world of biblical criticism, but I believe his footprints are also in the world of traditional Jewish scholarship by observant Jews who grapple with these same problems about the text of the Bible while trying to maintain their traditional Jewish practice of halakha. So we will look at a few of those really interesting sources of contemporary Jewish scholars at the beginning of next week's session. So with that, I'm going to conclude and leave just a few minutes for any questions, and we'll conclude with those questions and answers.
Mark?
Yes, Sam.
Although completely irrelevant to the teaching that you're doing, does there exist any writing or analysis by U.S. former Chief Justice Benjamin Cardozo on Spinoza?
I don't know, Sam. There may be, but I'm not aware of any. I haven't seen reference to that.
I ask it only because, number one, I'm interested, obviously, but he was such a brilliant man that it just struck me that I would be interested, man, and I will attempt to find what I can find. I would be interested in any comment that he would have, probably on anything, but particularly on Spinoza.
I'll look into it, Sam. I'll get back to you. As we saw, one of the members of his family, Rabbi Cardozo, who also has roots in, he was actually born in Amsterdam, had something to say about the continuing effect of the cherem in the Jewish world today. But I'll look into it and get back to you. Someone else has a raised hand. Well, Charlie, I see yours, so why don't you go ahead and then so anyone else can speak.
Yeah, when I was listening to what you were saying, Spinoza seemed very angry. I mean, when I attack someone else's work in the way Spinoza did, it means I really want to tear it apart. And I've done that. And it means you want it not to exist. And when we go back to the beginning, what Spinoza was saying about the creation, revelation, and God's role in history, those are three major pillars of religious Judaism. I'm not talking about cultural Judaism. I'm talking about religious, being a religious Jew. If you attack those three pillars, you basically are wiping out religious Judaism. So it seems to me Spinoza wants to throw this out. And if you go back to the story about Saul, was it Saul? I forgot which king, but where his age was left out in front of the world years. Basically, he's taking what could be a modern day typo. I mean, we have Torahs in the synagogue that have had scriptural errors, typos in them. If you look at the newsletter I put out, there's a glaring error right on page 1 on the date. Saturday, June something.
Charlie, let me address both. Let me address both. We have limited time. Let me address both of your points. Okay. The cherem, as we saw, was extremely vitriolic, very vehement, precisely for the reason you just identified. Spinoza's thought, and we have no writings of Spinoza from the time of the cherem, but we assume that he had communicated his heretical ideas with other people. Spinoza defied almost every aspect of fundamental classical Judaism. So there's nothing controversial about what you said. It's not surprising that the Amsterdam Jewish community responded with that vitriol.
Yeah, throw him out.
Yes, so they were justified in excommunicating him, but it was because his thought was incredibly original and radical and heretical. So, having said that, it's not so surprising that he was not, a little bit annoyed at the community that had excommunicated him on such harsh terms. He believed that people should be free thinking, should be allowed to be afforded freedom of thought. So that's the first. He was excommunicated on very vitriolic terms. I think he was angry, and some of his writings, you can see and hear the anger in his writing. But it's not just that. He wanted to prove the truth of what he was saying, and he was up against not just Jewish classical scholarship, but Christian. And he was writing primarily to a Christian audience, and he knew that he was going to get into trouble for what he was writing, but he was trying to say it on strong terms because there were not diverse opinions out there. There was sort of limited like-minded people, but he thought he had to speak in very strong terms. So yes, it could be a bit of anger and a bit of sort of harshness to win his argument. The second thing, Charlie, I'll say is, it's a little bit glib of you to say, oh, they're typos. That's not what traditional Jews believe about the Bible. You might have typos. You might have typos in your newsletter, but I know you work hard to avoid them, and there are very, very few mistakes in your newsletter. But that is an intolerable concept to traditional Jews with respect to the Torah. You can't just say, oh, Spinoza exploited what's just a typo.
I just want to say, I'm thinking that from
Quickly, Charlie.
point of view, because if he thinks it was written by someone else, it's not from God, it's not from Moses, it's not from this, then you would just say, well, the document has an error in it. Why would he? I forgot what language he used there, but basically he said the whole thing was defective.
Yeah,
So
because he's talking about, that's one of dozens and dozens of pieces of evidence that Spinoza marshals. And by the way, to show that the Hebrew, the text of the Torah has problems in it. That's not controversial, Charlie. The rabbis in our classical tradition also believe that there were problems in the biblical text. They just responded to and addressed those problems in different ways. I'm going to talk about that next week. They used midrash and midrashic devices to based on other assumptions to address the same problems. They were close readers too. But Spinoza says, in light of all these deficiencies, and if you don't resort to the presupposition that God revealed this, then you are forced to acknowledge that, like almost every other human document, the biblical text has what you would call typos and other problems chronologically. Charlie, I'm going to have to move on. I'm sorry. And I can take that offline with you, but you can't, within the framework of traditional Judaism, you can't say the Bible has typos. That is intolerable. Anyone else with a question?
Yes, yeah. Justo.
Go ahead.
Hopefully this will be a little bit shorter.
Justo, welcome.
Thanks. So the vitriol we see with these passages aside, is there any, how would you say you feel Spinoza's intentions were? Like, were they always a dialectic and, intended to respond to what is the current works and his opinion on that? Or were most of the time, would you say he was wholeheartedly philosophizing and just getting his stuff out there? At least for these passages, as well as like for maybe his broader works in general, his motivations.
It's a good question, Justo. I think it's actually both. He was committed to what he thought was the truth. So he wanted to disseminate the truth in again, terms that were necessarily harsh and strong, because he was trying to overcome centuries on both the Jewish and Christian sides of contrary opinion. So he had to speak, sort of polemically to overcome what the Jewish and Christian communities believed was the contrary truth in order to win his argument. But he also goes back, Justo, to what I mentioned earlier, that he really believed that these theologians, these ecclesiastical authorities, again, he probably had in mind both the rabbis of Jewish communities, but even more importantly, the Christian theologians who had power to dictate freedom of thought of other people. He wanted them put on the sidelines. That again, they could think what they want, but they shouldn't dictate to other free-thinking people what the common person in Holland or in Europe should think and do. So he had to, I think he was committed to the truth. He wanted the truth out there, but he had to write polemically and strongly in order to overcome people who wanted him shut up and shut down. Again, not just the Jewish authorities, but many Christian authorities deemed him a heretic and banned his work. And his legacy emerged despite that. But he had to speak and write quite polemically and powerfully in order to overcome that resistance.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I have a question. So Spinoza did not believe in the chosenness of the Jewish people. He did not believe in the covenant, I believe. Is that correct?
That's correct. He didn't, as a logical byproduct of his belief in God. God doesn't create, God doesn't choose. God is essentially nature.
So did he ever have any comment on the fact that he and the Jews persisted and existed over those 2,000 years despite all odds? And the great line is, what happened to the Hittites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the Jews are still around?
Yeah, so the answer is yes, he did, Hal. He did comment on it. He believed, by the way, that the Bible has utility. It's not an ordinary sort of book. It should be read as if it were a regular book, but it has great moral teachings in it, and it served a national purpose, a political purpose during the commonwealths of the Jewish people. It served to create sort of guidelines and foundations for an important political life of the Jews. Even though he didn't believe that God actually chose the Jews, the Jews, through their whatever sort of genius they had, created an important human document in the Bible. But he actually was among the first, or perhaps the first, to say that anti-Semitism was another primary cause of the survival of the Jews, that Jews sort of responded to anti-Semitism with a great will to survive. Other people have said that and sort of defined Jewishness in terms of a response to anti-Semitism. Famously in the 20th century, Jean-Paul Sartre said that as well. So Spinoza did comment on how Jews were able to survive. He didn't really think that Judaism per se had any sort of remaining value or import in the Jewish world, in the Western world, that Jews and non-Jews could reach truths about the world and about God and about the Bible without resort to Jewish practice and Jewish beliefs. So for him, he thought Jewishness and Judaism had a value for a time in history. It no longer had that continuing value, and that we have survived, but there's no real need to continue that survival. How about one more question, if any?
I'll ask one more if no one else does.
Okay, does anyone else have a question? Okay, Justo?
So I've noticed that he uses what people might call "quote unquote" logical reasoning to deduce religious conclusions and facts and statements. But it also sounds like, and this is just my opinion, he's trying to separate the secular, logical, whatever, from theological reasoning. But he's also mixing the two. Would you say that any of that, that separation of the two of the kinds of reasoning, was maybe his motivating factor? Do you think that's what he's doing as well, whether he knows it or not?
Well, I think he is trying to separate. I think he is trying to create, and in fact, he did create sort of a secular way of thinking about religious issues, including the Bible. That's why I think he really sort of created the world of biblical criticism in viewing the Bible through a scientific lens. I don't know that he had any particularly sort of dispositive theological presuppositions. He did conceive of God in a certain way that I think led to a lot of the rest of his thinking. We'll talk about that next week. So one could argue that his conception of God influenced him. But explicitly, expressly, I think he wanted to separate theological presuppositions from the study of religious texts and concepts. So again, to sort of sideline theological assumptions that both Jews and Christians made about the world, including about the Bible, put those to the side and read and interpret and understand the world and traditional texts through a critical scientific lens. Okay,
Thanks.
sure. I'm going to stop there. So hope you join me for the last session next Sunday morning. We'll talk about Spinoza's, we'll wrap up the biblical criticism theme and talk about Spinoza's interesting conception of God that both had Jewish roots and a Jewish legacy. By the way, the Israel Day Parade March is early this afternoon for Or Zarua, so you're welcome to join the contingent later on. But thank you for joining me this morning. Have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you next week.
Thank you, Mark. See you. Good lecture.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Mark.
Take care, everyone.